Hopefully this is live. We'll see. I wanted to do a live stream just to talk through some of the stuff that's been going on right now in the world of cameras, because it's really interesting. It's really fascinating. The new stuff that's coming out. We've got stuff from Sony. We've got stuff from Blackmagic Design. We've got stuff from Canon. I'm sure there's always more cameras coming, but it's great to see that this stuff is finally starting to roll out. The A7s III, long anticipated. I think they're even on the A7 IV, but the S model has still been on the 2. So it's really hard to track all the model names and numbers, especially between all these different brands. But the A7S, highly regarded as one of the best premier cameras in that kind of DSLR mirrorless form factor. Obviously, I've been shooting GH4, GH5 for quite a while. Also, Ursa Mini is kind of my kit, but I work closely with other people who love the Sony cameras. So the A7S III is really cool to see. We've also got the Ursa Mini 12K, which is kind of mind-boggling, just the sheer resolution that's available for something that's only $10,000, which is pretty incredible, especially coming from the 4.6K Ursa Mini. That's a huge leap, and definitely kind of steals a little bit of thunder away from Canon, who also has the R5 and the R6. The R5, the big wow factor there is 8K. R6, not quite as much, but we're going to go through all this stuff, talk about it, kind of break these down. I thought I'd share some of my thoughts on all of these cameras. Spoiler, I'm not a huge fan of any one of them in particular. I think they all have interesting features that they kind of offer and they bring to market, but is there any one that is like the absolute, like the game changer? You have to have this camera? No, I think if you have a camera currently, you're probably fine. If you have something that's older and you've been waiting to upgrade, now is definitely a good time. But there might be some other stuff on the horizon that maybe is worth waiting a little bit longer if you can. So we'll go through these one at a time. I'm doing this live. I'll also post some clips, just segments, as well after the fact. They're a little bit higher resolution. Hopefully there's not any like delays or lag, or if there's any audio problems, like the way live streaming goes. It's just kind of the nature of it. So I'll record this separately, upload those as well, but we can at least talk through it. That way, if anyone has any questions, they want to chime in, they can in the live chat, but you don't have to either. This is how I record videos anyway, so I might as well do it live as well. So with that being said, I can start talking about let's start with the Sony. Why not? Sony has announced the A7s III. Long anticipated. People have been waiting for this camera for a long time, and rightfully so. It's got some really cool features that have been lacking from the A7s Mark II. There have been other A7 cameras, but the A7s Mark II is one of those just like perfect for video, for the people who shoot with it. And really, there's just those few extra features that a version 3, people were just fingers crossed hoping that Sony would bring, and thankfully they have. I'm sure there's plenty of videos out there talking about the specs, and of course you can look that up. We'll go through it even a little bit, but just right off the gate, I am a GH5 shooter as well as an Ursa Mini shooter. GH4 was kind of like my first 4K camera. So that's where I come from. I don't shoot with an A7. I have in the past as like kind of rentals. I've tested them out. I have a couple friends that shoot with the A7 Sony cameras. So I don't hold them kind of like, I don't hate them, but I also don't love them. I'm not like a fan. I'm just like, I've had the A7s II and I've just been waiting for the 3. If that's you, you probably already know you want this camera and you want to buy it. Maybe for people on the fence who are looking to upgrade, maybe looking to switch from something else, that's kind of where I come into this. And I feel like maybe my perspective is valuable coming from a GH5, which is micro four thirds. And of course, we all want to shoot full frame. So with the Sony doing that and a mirrorless body that's relatively affordable, it's a very attractive camera. So we can talk about what the A7s III brings new to the table and talk about if it's really worth the upgrade, if it's worth the switch, kind of what we think. And I'll share some of my thoughts on that. So if we want to take a look at the Sony A7s Mark III, we can go through here. And it's a really cool landing page they have here on B&H where they've kind of done some, I don't know, how do you describe this? It's like custom layout that they've added to B&H, which is kind of nice that they do this per camera, but it can also make just getting down to the specs kind of annoying as well. But here they have a nice comparison between the A7S III versus the other A7 cameras, or at least the A7S Mark II and the A7 III. The big feature with the A7S Mark III is that you can shoot 4K at 120 frames a second. Is that valuable? Yes, absolutely. Is it the resolution, killer like that Canon and Blackmagic and a few other camera companies are bringing to the table? No, it's still just 4K, but honestly, when most of us talk about video resolution and we're talking about this stuff, 4K is usually good enough for modern context, right? If you want to future proof and you're worried about a future where 8K becomes a norm for whatever reason, even though 4K hasn't really been adopted as a viewing medium, like we can have those debates, but 4K across the board is good. It's not 1080, which in today's day and age, if this was a 1080p camera, like I think everyone would just laugh, right? But it's not, bringing any resolution, extra bells and whistles there. It's bringing the frame rate, which 4K 120 is great. I mean, the Ursa Mini Pro Gen 2 does 4K 120, which is beautiful. And having that feature in your camera and something that's like available, doesn't really fit in your pocket with a lens, but like let's say it's pocketable, the A7S III, really, really valuable. It's got the internal image stabilization. Sony has thankfully fixed their terrible screen design. For the longest time, it was one of my biggest hangups with the Sony cameras was just the screen wouldn't flip all the way around. They fixed that, so now they have a proper articulating screen like almost everybody else has. So all that's great. Basically, I think Sony's kind of looked at the market, looked at what other companies are doing, look at what people want, and kind of made a really nice hybrid camera that can kind of do everything you'd want. You don't have to shoot 4K 120 by any means. You can also do 4K 60 if you want. But it's a good all-around camera. The one thing I might criticize it for is oddly enough, is that it's only 12 megapixels resolution. So if you are looking for a true hybrid, don't expect a lot in the photography department with this one. You're not going to have those beautiful resolutions to work with for portrait photography or landscapes or prints that you might have with some of the other A7 cameras, like the A7R, that's going to give you tons of resolution. Granted, the A7S is specifically meant for video, and that's what this is in mind. But if you do like a camera that can do a little bit of both, I do think it would have been nice to upgrade the photography side. But to be fair, the A7S is meant to do really well in low light. And so having larger photo sites allows the camera to kind of see in the dark, as they say, and do better at higher ISOs. Now, I wouldn't look at this though as like the main feature. I've talked about this in the past about the A7S cameras, in that shooting in low light is valuable in certain situations, but most of the time for good looking images, you want there to be some light. Light is how you see and shape your image. Where there's light, where there isn't light. This right now is being lit to look a certain way. If you go into any environment and you just shoot and it's low light, you might have to in certain situations, if you're shooting a documentary or something like that, where you just don't, you're run and gun, you can only bring the camera with you, you can't bring lights, you can't do anything. Totally valid. You want something that can do well in low light. But if you're looking for the most cinematic images, the most film-like images, most of the time, those aren't going to be low light situations. You're going to want some kind of light to kind of shape and help your image. Now, is it helpful that you don't need as much light, as much power? Yeah, that's helpful. But a lot of times you're going to be shooting in daylight as well, where you have full sun, and it's not a problem. So I look at the low light thing as like, it's a nice feature, but it's not necessarily for me a must have, which is why with like the GH4 and the GH5, I went that route compared to Sony, because those cameras were much more video centric at the time and really helpful in having all those great video features like the flip screen, like continuous recording, like not overheating, like a long battery life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now Sony, from my perspective, has finally brought to the table a full frame mirrorless camera that suits almost all of those needs. And what's great about that is that Sony's finally done it, which is awesome. And I applaud them for it. Is it enough to get people to switch? Me personally, probably not. I don't think I'm going to give up all of my lenses, all of my kit for something that, it does shoot slightly higher frame rate. So I can do 4K 120, better low light. But on the flip side, I'm eagerly anticipating a GH6, the follow-up to S1H, the Lumix S1H, finally, when they went full frame. And they have that. So like I look at the Sony as a really good option, as a great choice if you have a bunch of Sony lenses already. But is it enough to get me to switch or to move? Or for a lot of people, I don't know. I'd be curious to know what you think based on your own personal habits in shooting. I think it is finally great that Sony shooters actually get a proper video camera in their kind of hybrid mirrorless DSLR kind of camera. A lot of people say, well, you don't need these features or there's workarounds, but like at the end of the day, you usually want the most streamlined, smooth experience possible. One camera that you don't always have to rig out. You can if you want to, but you don't have to rely on external batteries and external adapters and like all this stuff to make it work, like a fan to cool it down. All that stuff is really, really annoying. And it's just nice to have something that just works right out of the box. And I think that's finally what we have with the A7s III. So I applaud Sony. I think it's going to be a great camera. They do say that you can record 4K 60 for over an hour without overheating. But that makes me wonder that, like, can you not go longer than that? Like, it's so mind boggling to me that these camera manufacturers are making cameras that like, yeah, you can do it, but it overheats. Now, granted, you probably will never run into that situation with Sony, at least hopefully. Only real world testing will kind of let you know that, you know, so maybe if you're cautious and you've had overheating issues with Sony cameras in the past, maybe give it a rental before you actually go out and buy it. But for me, the GH cameras, granted, they're a smaller sensor, but like they never overheat. And like I shoot in Phoenix in the desert. It's like incredibly hot. And like I've never once had it heat on me. So it's so weird to have, you know, these cameras that like have all these great features, but like you can't hardly use them because they overheat. That's separate. That's more pegged towards Canon than Sony, but Sony does mention it. There's some other features that you should know about on the Sony A7s Mark III that it can do 10-bit 422. It can do RAW 16-bit over HDMI, if that's of interest to you. Most of the time with the, you know, fancier codecs, often they end up becoming really cumbersome in like an H.264 or even H.265 encoder. Like editing that footage is not nearly as fun. And maybe that sounds weird, but it's really fun to edit ProRes. When you're shooting with the Ursa Mini, it just edits smoothly, like flawlessly. Like there's no chug or delay. You get that a little bit on the GH5, not quite as bad as I've had it with some other, like H.265 specifically, you know, depending on your setup, depending on your computer, depending on what you're editing with, like you just have to be cautious. Like a codec can sound really nice and like, oh, won't it be great when I can do 10-bit 422 and it's 4K and it's 120 frames? Like it sounds great. And then in practice, when you go to edit it, it can be really annoying because it can slow your machine down and you might have to make proxies and it can slow down your workflow. And you may not be getting, depending on how you color correct and how you edit projects, you may not be getting the full benefits. So it is something to like look at as a nice feature. Even RAW file sizes are going to be a lot larger. So if you're used to like, you know, 8-bit 420 and then going to 16-bit RAW, 120 frames, 4K, like it may overwhelm you, your hard drives, your setup. So all of the features on paper that, you know, even with like what Canon is doing with the 8K or Ursa Mini with the 12K, like these things sound really nice, but then in practice, they can become overwhelming. Thankfully, 4K, you know, what used to be that way for 4K, hard drives and everything has gotten a lot cheaper. Things have gotten faster. Computers have gotten better. So like stuff always catches up, but it usually seems that on the acquisition side, it's usually kind of the cutting edge. And then you kind of have to work through that workflow to find a way to make it work for you. And it's certainly better than it used to be, where you had to log and transfer and you had to make everything ProRes, like otherwise it wouldn't play at all. Like, but there is something to be said about just being able to shoot ProRes. The fact that it just is so sturdy and reliable and just a good, efficient codec for editing is really, really nice. And I appreciate anytime I'm editing Ursa Mini footage compared to something that comes from more of like a hybrid mirrorless camera, because it just edits smoother and better. So also something to keep in mind as you look at the specs on the A7s Mark III. It does have the internal stabilization. It's not quite as good as some other cameras. I think it's like 5.5 stops of stabilization. Combine that with a lens, maybe you'll get a little bit better. But really, I think it's just Sony has done a really good job rounding out this camera and kind of adding the features that we're desperately missing. The battery life is supposedly better. I believe it's 60% better. Whatever that means in practice, we'll see, considering you're shooting, you know, a faster frame rate now. So it's all kind of like just numbers on paper until you actually try it out. But Upgraded the battery life, better performance there. They've got the flip screen finally, thank goodness. And they're actually offering some decent codecs and some nicer frame rate options, considering the A7s II, you were capped out at 4K 30. So to go from 4K 30 to 4K 120, I'm sure if you're an A7s shooter, like you're happily upgrade. The price is $3,500, which isn't unreasonable for what you get. It's actually probably a pretty good deal, all things considered, but that is a hefty investment if you don't have any Sony glass and this is like something brand new. You're gonna have to invest a lot in fast memory cards and lenses, batteries. Like it's an undertaking, but I do think it is a great option for people out there who are looking for more features in their camera set. If you've been shooting with the A7s Mark II and you've only been able to do 4K 30 and you haven't been able to do any slow motion in 4K, that's really, really frustrating. Meanwhile, people with the GH5 have been doing 4K 60 for what has it been? I don't know, a long time now, 3 or 4 years, whatever it's been. So to finally have that feature is, I think, very, very welcome and good to have in the marketplace. And competition is always good. At the end of the day, that's the best thing, is that Canon has new stuff, Sony has new stuff, Blackmagic has new stuff, Panasonic with Lumix is going to have new stuff. Nikon, who cares? It doesn't usually matter or factor into this. Red is always doing new stuff. So it's just great to finally see this stuff become these high-end premium features that have been relatively expensive trickle down and kind of become more mainstream in consumer, prosumer products like the A7s III. And it's just finally good to be out there. I've been sick of the rumors and hearing about this camera and people constantly talking about when's it coming, when's it coming, when's it coming. It's like, all right, it's finally here. Now we can worry about the version 4 that's inevitably coming later. So glad that it's there, glad it's an option. And I probably won't personally be buying it, but maybe it's right for you. So there we go. That's a video done in the bag. And moving on, we can talk about, feel free, if you want to leave a comment in the chat, by all means, go for it, but you don't necessarily have to either. Let's talk about the Blackmagic 12K. Blackmagic recently announced the Ursa Mini Pro 12K, and I think quite a few people were stunned, shocked, blown away, thought it was maybe April Fool's or something like that, considering Canon had just announced the 8K R5. Blackmagic has to beat them at their own game and offer up the Ursa Mini Pro 12K. Now, I love the Ursa Mini. I've shot with the Ursa Mini, the original 4.6K, the Ursa Mini Pro, the Gen 1, and then the Ursa Mini Pro Gen 2. All of them beautiful, wonderful, marvelous cameras. If you don't know anything about the Ursa Mini, one thing you should know, the Ursa Mini 4.6K, the original one, had an awesome giant LCD flip out screen that they made smaller in the Pros, which is not something you see on the spec sheet. It's not something anyone really tells you or goes the other way. They're like, hey, the LCD is smaller, but it's noticeably smaller, which is really irritating. Also to note, on the Ursa Mini Pro Gen 2, the most recent Ursa Mini Pro, aside from the 12K that's coming, the Gen 2 doesn't ship with the side handle, which is really frustrating considering it came standard in the previous models. That the side handle, they just decided, no, that's out. And now you have to pay $200 to get it. I suppose you could get a different side handle if you want, but it's something to note because it'll kind of probably catch you off guard if you're expecting to buy an Ursa Mini and you're like, oh, I want the Gen 2. It's the newest, latest one. And then you go, wait, where's the side handle? It's not in the box. You have to buy it separate. But anyway, let's talk about the 12K, because this camera, I mean, you can shoot 12K at 60 frames a second. So you can do slow-mo 12K. That's beautiful. That's incredible. You can do 8K at 110 frames a second. You can do 4K at 220 frames a second. This camera, for only $10,000. Granted, you're going to have to do some upgrades. You're going to have to get batteries. It's going to be more than 10,000. Don't get me wrong. It's not 10,000 just to like shoot. Yeah, if you plug into the wall, you don't have any EVF or anything like that, and you just shoot with the camera, like no batteries. Yeah, $10,000 for 12K. That's a pretty good deal if you ask me. And considering the track record that Blackmagic has had, I'm very, very optimistic about this camera. Now, is it right for everybody? Is it right for me? Probably not. It's probably overkill at this point in time. I mean, this is definitely something meant for the high-end cinema. Like if you're putting your projects in theaters, if you're going to be, I don't know, doing IMAX or something, right? Like that's what this camera is meant for. I'm curious to see the 12K YouTube videos, but at the end of the day, most people don't even have 4K monitors. Sometimes they're still 1080p. So now we're talking about 6K, 8K, now 12K. Very valuable for any kind of visual effects. If you're in After Effects, you're doing compositing, or you want to be able to reframe in post-production and do kind of like a multicam sort of thing. There are some downsides to that because it's from the one focal point of the one lens. You can kind of tell. You even get that sometimes with 4K, right? Where people punch in and they pan and scan and they move stuff around. It's like you can tell that it's just a punch in and you're going to get the same effect at 8K and 12K. Is it nice that you can zoom and reframe in post without losing a ton of resolution? Yeah, that's great. Is it something you're going to want to do all the time? I don't know. I shoot 4K a lot, and I'm not usually doing a lot of pan and scan. I want kind of the premium 4K look and feel, so I don't want to degrade that. Now, granted, having something 12K downsampling to 4K, I'm sure is going to look stunning and it'll be great, just like 8K or 6K would as well. So is it the end all be all of like you have to have the most resolution? No. Same thing applies to photography. You don't have to have the most megapixels to take the best photos. Is it a helpful feature to have in certain situations? Are the additional frame rates, the higher frame rates at higher resolutions helpful? Yes, absolutely. So if those are things you need, per project, where you could either rent the camera, or if you're doing those types of projects all the time, you could buy it. But for me, I'm not doing that stuff all the time. It's not my day in, day out of having like super high resolution stuff or super, high resolution and high frame rate at the same time. A majority of the work that I'm doing is talking head type stuff. So normal speed, like for most films, like that's kind of how it's going to be as well. If you have anything that's scripted or narrative, of course, having the slow motion features like 4K 60 and 4K 120 are helpful. But is there a situation where you need 12K 60 or 4K 220? Like that's where you start to get, the really high end bells and whistles that aren't always just like what you want to use on every single project, because at the end of the day, the file sizes are going to be a lot bigger. I mean, especially if you're shooting if you're getting up into kind of the raw territory, or you're shooting high end ProRes codecs, like having high frame rates, having high resolution in a really quality premium codec is just going to eat through your hard drives, and you're just going to run out of space unless you're doing something that's really short clips, which might be good for like a music video where the final output is only 3 minutes. But a lot of stuff, if it's like narrative or it's documentary and you have talking heads and you're doing long form recordings, I don't want to record 12K of an interview, because at the end of the day, it's probably unnecessary. And you could probably do some artistic, like fun, creative stuff with it. But again, for the majority of the time, most of the time, these features are like overkill, probably. So if you can afford it, by all means, invest. It's $10,000. Like cameras have been historically a lot more expensive. So in the grand scheme of things, it's very, very cheap and it's very, very affordable, especially for what it does. And I love Blackmagic. So if you can afford it, by all means, invest, get it. But if you're looking at it, you're going, well, I don't know. I might for like $10,000 base for just the body, I could actually get like a whole Ursa Mini Gen 2 kit. I'd say probably go that route, even if you're considering it, because you're going to have to add on to the 12K as well. So it's going to be more expensive. It's going to be more like 15,000. Probably around 15,000, all things considered, maybe even higher than that, depending on if you're buying a bunch of memory cards, because those are going to be expensive, and you have to buy hard drives. That's going to eat up costs there too. So maybe 15 to 20,000, depending on how rigged out your kit is. Might be better suited getting Ursa Mini Pro Gen 2 for about 10K, all things included. And then you have 4.6K. You can shoot raw. You can do high frame rates. You can do 4K 120. You can do 1080 240. Like you can do a lot of the stuff that the 12K is going to do. And you're going to have a fully featured camera body where you have an EVF, you have batteries, you have memory cards, you have all the things you actually need to shoot and to film. So that might be the better route to go. For me, that's probably what I would recommend. But again, if the price is not enough, if if the price doesn't matter, then yeah, obviously get the 12K because that's just awesome. Having the ability to shoot 12K, why not? Bring it on. And that's why I like this. What this makes me most excited for is not necessarily the Ursa Mini 12K, the Ursa Mini Pro 12K. Blackmagic needs to figure out their names a little bit because they've got the Ursa, which a lot of people forget about, but there's an Ursa and then there's an Ursa Mini. At least I tend to forget about the Ursa. The Ursa Mini is the one that like I want because it's smaller and it does most of the same things. I don't even think there is an Ursa 12K. I think it's just the Ursa Mini Pro 12K. As far as I've seen, maybe there's going to be an Ursa 24K. Who knows? I don't know. What it makes me most excited about is the next generation of their Pocket Cinema cameras, because the Pocket Cinema Camera 4K and the Pocket Cinema Camera 6K, both very, very cool cameras, do a lot of the things you would want at a much more affordable price, much smaller package for most regular shooters, like the vast majority of people out there, does everything you would need. Lacks some things like built-in ND filters, so it's not quite everything that you want all in one, but it's close. The Ursa Mini Pro 12K makes me really excited to see what they have lined up for the Pocket Cinema, like the next iteration of that. At this point, they should probably come up with a new name. That's what I would recommend to Blackmagic. It's like Pocket Cinema Camera 4K, Pocket Cinema Camera. Like these names are too long. They're too complicated. There is a Pocket Cinema camera, and the Pocket Cinema Camera 4K is very different. So like they're not even really like the same product anymore. Come up with a new name. Ursa is a cool name. Ursa Mini, okay. I guess it's a smaller version. That kind of makes sense. Come up with some new names that aren't just Pocket Cinema camera. That doesn't, I don't know. It's not like Red Komodo, which sounds like, oh, that sounds like a cool camera that I want to buy. I don't think people are too excited about the Pocket Cinema camera. I mean, I guess it's very descriptive. It tells you what it is, but you can't even fit it in your pocket. So it's not even accurate at that. Anyway, going off on a tangent, the Ursa Mini Pro 12K looks really, really cool, and I would highly recommend it if you can afford it and you're willing to put down some serious money. But again, historically speaking, it's not that serious. You know, this is still within the realm of kind of that prosumer market of someone could reasonably afford this and they're not taking out a second mortgage on their house. I mean, it's getting up there. It's getting close to like car level territory of pricing, right? You're starting to get 20,000, 30,000, 40,000. Okay, now the Red cameras, like you're spending, you could basically get a car for the same price. Maybe that's not such a wise investment for a camera that could easily be stolen or lost. So make sure you have insurance. That's another thing when you're spending a lot of money on equipment, make sure it's protected. But also, you know, don't feel like you need to buy it just to have it. I think the Gen 2 Ursa Mini Pro is fantastic. I would highly recommend that camera, especially for somebody coming from kind of the DSLR hybrid mirrorless photography video cameras. If you want to upgrade to something that has built-in NDs, that's going to actually look like a professional kind of cinema proper camera. So people don't think that you're taking photos all the time. They know, oh, you're doing video. That's one of my biggest pet peeves about the smaller cameras is people still to this day don't understand that you can shoot video. They look and go, oh, you're taking pictures? No, you avoid all that with the Ursa Mini. It's beautiful. It's still small enough that you can fit it in a backpack. Granted, it has to be a large backpack, but you can do it. And it does everything you'd want. And it's got kind of those like high-end, like XLR inputs. Like it just does all the things you would want it to do right there, especially if you rig it out with the shoulder kit. Everything's there and you just put a battery on it, put a memory card in, and you're ready to go. You don't have to have additional monitors and EVFs and ND filters and audio recorders and all the annoyance that comes from hybrid shooting with smaller, cheaper cameras, which that's the trade-off, right? You spend a little bit less, you have to do some workarounds. The Ursa Mini is fantastic in that it just does everything you would want. Beautiful dynamic range, shoots ProRes. Oh, the best part of the Ursa Mini is just the menu interface. The touchscreen menu, if you've never used an Ursa Mini, the menu is probably the best on any camera I've ever used. And I've shot Red, shot Sony, shot Canon, I've shot them all. And the Ursa Mini is my favorite. It's like fun to use the menu. I've talked about this. I think I did the Ursa Mini review years ago. It's just a fun menu to use. It's like your iPhone. Like that's how it feels to operate the camera. And you can just do things seamlessly, and you can change resolution and frame rate and formats all very quickly and very seamlessly. Whereas almost every other camera, even the GH5, which I enjoy using, and it has an okay menu, it's still so cumbersome to go in there and move stuff around, and you're always on the wrong page and you got to scroll, and it's a headache. The Ursa Mini makes all that go away. And I think every camera system should look at Blackmagic and go, hey, that's a really good menu. Let's just steal it. I mean, don't steal it, like do your own work, but you know what I mean? Like just copy it because it's by far the best. I'm sure there's some tweaks they can make to make it a little bit better. But when you're coming from stuff like Sony, the Sony menu, granted, they say they've changed it a little bit on the A7s III. They've changed the menu to be a little bit better, but I've seen screenshots. It doesn't look that much better. The Ursa Mini, best menu interface, hands down. And now they have 12K. It's like what? Like if you buy that camera, it's going to last you a long time, a long, long time. Because I don't think we're blowing past that anytime soon, at least not within the next couple of years. So if you make the 12K investment, you know, that's probably a good investment for the long run, because you're not going to feel like your camera got outdated just last year. So for me, probably stick with the G2 Ursa Mini Pro. Not quite worth it to make the upgrade, but if you've never shot with the Ursa Mini and you've been looking to make the upgrade and you can afford it, go for the 12K. It'd probably be a fantastic camera, considering the track record that Blackmagic has had. They're only getting better. Pop over here, and the last one we're going to talk about is the Canon R5. Hey, is it Luis? Just got here. Nice to see you. Hey, what's going on? Why not the Canon Cinema line as alternative? You know, the Canon stuff is just not affordable for most people. I think it's a little overpriced considering all the features of the Ursa Mini. And every time that I've had to deal with the Canon stuff, granted, I haven't used every single one. I haven't shot the C700 and the C500 or the Mark II, right? There's a lot of variations. There's the C100, the 300, the 500, the 700, and then Mark IIs of some of those. I don't know if they're in Mark IIIs. I don't follow it as closely because, frankly, Canon I think is kind of overpriced. And the times I have used the Canon cameras, they usually come with really annoying codecs that are a pain to edit. So like any camera that shoots MXF, I just want to light that camera on fire. That's garbage. MXF files, so this is like Sony, Canon. I don't know if any of the newer ones still do it. The thing I love about Blackmagic and the Ursa Mini is that it shoots ProRes. And if you want to shoot raw, you can, and you can deal with that workflow, and you can have all the headaches of conversions and all that stuff, and you have to buy the right system, and then you can edit it smoothly. But the great thing about ProRes is that it just works. It's been around forever. People know it. The software knows it. There's not any updates you need for it. It's not any conversions or utility or drivers or anything. It just works. And that's what's best about ProRes, and why I'm sure I know it comes with a fee and you have to pay a license and all this stuff to Apple. Do it. It makes life so much easier to not have to transcode after the fact, to make editing easier. Like the Ursa Mini files go into the computer and they just work all the time, every time. And that's what's best. And so people get external recorders, right? And they do stuff like that with Atomos and whatnot to do ProRes that way. But then you have an external monitor, an external recorder. It's nice when everything's right in the camera. So you can literally take it out of your bag, put a battery on it, put a lens on it, put a memory card in, and you're done. You have ND filters, you have everything you need. So that's why I like the Ursa Mini. It's for the price point, like that's what's I kind of ironic or funny, or I don't know, however you want to describe it, but like the fact that it's so cheap, you think like, oh, like I'll have to deal with this like inefficiency of it, or like it won't be as good as something else. And 99% of the time, people don't know. They think they don't know that it's not Alexa, right? They don't know that it's not a red when they're looking at the footage. If they look at the camera, they can obviously tell because it doesn't say red on it, which is what most people expect to see. Oh, like, oh, you have a red. That's the best camera ever. It's like, well, you can do a lot with an Ursa Mini that's basically the same in terms of dynamic range and resolution and being able to shoot raw and like all the stuff, higher frame rates and higher resolutions. So being able to get all that for a price point that's like really inexpensive and cheap compared to everybody else. And then like there aren't workarounds, like the menu is actually better than like the red menu and like every other camera out there. it's just really nice and refreshing to have something so affordable. And I think maybe that's why the Ursa Mini, like people look at it like, oh, it's cheaper, so it's like not as good. Having used it, it's a joy. It's like hands down, it's like one of my favorite cameras to shoot with. Aside from like, I mean, like the GH5 is also really, really a delight to use as well. But that's for kind of other reasons and just the simplicity and the size and all that. So if you're looking for like a professional premium camera, don't feel like you have to spend 50 grand on a red. Like you can get an Ursa Mini Pro and do a lot. Even like, yeah, because now the Gen 2's out, like even the original, well, the Ursa Mini 4.6K. This is where like Blackmagic, their names just suck. The original Ursa Mini 4.6K, the one goofy thing was that you needed like an IR cut filter. So when you would use NDs, you would need, and there weren't built-in NDs on that one, if I'm recalling correctly. There weren't internal NDs. You had to use screw-on NDs, and if you did, the sensor was really, really susceptible to IR pollution, like infrared light, meaning it would like the camera can pick up the infrared light that your eyes can't see, meaning stuff would turn magenta. So this would happen like black, like my shirt would look like pink or magenta because there's like infrared light coming from it. So that's the one tricky thing. So I wouldn't recommend the original Ursa Mini 4.6K because it had some quirkiness stuff to it. But the Gen 1 Ursa Mini Pro Gen 1, beautiful, lovely camera. And then if you want to make the upgrade to the Gen 2 for some of the extra frame rate stuff, by all means, go for it. But yeah, the Gen 1 is fantastic. And historically speaking, I'm broke for any of these kind of cameras. Totally fine. Like you don't have to, like you could shoot beautiful footage on a GH2. You don't need a GH4 is relatively cheap, and you can you 4K. Like the beauty of an image doesn't come necessarily from the camera. It's helpful to have more dynamic range, more resolution, higher frame rates, better color science. But in general, the majority of it is coming from the lights. It's coming from makeup. It's coming from wardrobe. It's coming from like what is in the frame, like what do the people look like, or what do the trees look like, what did the city look like, what does the room look like, what's in the frame, and how well that's designed and put together and how good looking that is. You can shoot something like, don't forget, like for a long time, movies were still shot 1080p with like the Alexa, right? The original Alexa. 1080p is good enough. That's all you need. You don't need 4K. That's too, you don't need that fancy stuff. It's like, no, like, so there were movies, like professional Hollywood movies, they shot at 1080p. So like you have 4K and a GH4 for like probably, I think they're under $1,000 now. Like it's not about the camera and how much you spend there. Put your money elsewhere. Put it in lights, put it in actors, put it in makeup, set design, wardrobe, all the stuff that is the image, right? Because the camera just captures it. It just takes a picture of what's there. What's there is what matters. And oftentimes that's lost because you look at a spec sheet for a camera and it's like, wow, 12K, that's amazing. Yeah, but what does your subject look like? What does the environment look like? Is it just another video of your cat? Because that's probably going to look the same as it did in 4K when you filmed test footage of it 10 years ago. You know, like there's just only so much that happens with just like the trees in your backyard or like your dog, you know, or like, oh, the like downtown city streets, you know, like that's the thing, right? Like most cameras, like you'll see like low light tests in like the city. Like most cameras can film perfectly fine at nighttime in the city now because there's lights, there's stores, there's windows, there's stuff providing lighting, and you have like ISO, you know, 1600, 3200, 6400 in some cases. You get a fast lens, and like you can see, it's not pitch black, you know, it's not like, but like you go into the woods. Okay, so I was just up north doing some like time lapses, and like you can see like the stars. Of course, yes, you can see stars in your time lapses, and but if you're in the deep dark woods and you try to film something and there's literally no light, it doesn't matter how slow your shutter speed is. You can have an exposure for like 30 seconds. You can have a fast lens and you can have high ISO. You're still not going to see anything because there's no light there. it's like amplifying nothing. It's a long exposure. Like there's no light. So at the end, at a certain point, the ability to shoot in low light is kind of meaningless because at some point there is no light, in which case you can't see anything anyway. So it's like it's nice to have clean images, I guess, in low light, but most cameras, even the ones that are like bad in low light, are still good for the most part. Even the cheap ones. So just something to keep in mind. Might be a good time to get a deal on a G2 UMP, a G2 Ursa Mini Pro. Yes. Yeah, probably. Although I don't imagine the 12K. So the Ursa Mini Pro Gen 2, that'll do 4.6K and it'll do 4K 120. I imagine that'll stay kind of the same price as it is currently because the 12K is the higher price point up. So right now the G2 is like 6,000 and the 12K is 10,000. Maybe the G2 will see a slight, price drop, or people who are selling it used, will be trying to get rid of it. But I don't think the price point will come down that much compared to like if you're like the Gen 1 Ursa Mini Pro compared to the Gen 2. The Gen 1 is probably pretty cheap because like the Gen 2 is better, but also not by much. But like price point at the release, it's like the same. So it's kind of that like the iPhone syndrome a little bit, where like every new year there's like the latest greatest iPhone, and then all of a sudden like the old ones are like, oh, that's garbage now. It's like, no, wait, that was good last year. What happened? So that's just inevitable, I think. Thankfully, the 12K is like such a big increase that they increased the price as well. 10K isn't that cheap, but I understand the features aren't even close. So 10K, yes, 10K is not cheap. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's affordable. I'm saying historically speaking, when film cameras and to do anything cinema, like digital cinema, what, 100K, $200,000, like you couldn't even buy the cameras because they were so expensive. So like, yes, in the modern context, $10,000 is expensive when you're looking at a GH5 or you're looking at a Sony A7s III or you're looking at a Canon R6. And then you see, oh my goodness, 12K, $10,000, that's really expensive, plus all the add-ons. Yes, expensive. Historically speaking, though, not that expensive for the features you're getting. So that's the difference there. Max Yuriev is having a hard time editing the 4K files from the R5 in his video. Well, I'm sure he is because it's a Canon, and we're going to get to Canon because that's the next segment that we're going to talk about. 28 days later was shot on the Canon XL1. Yes, XL1. Actually, funny enough, XL1S, it wasn't the XL1, it was the XL1S, but basically the same thing, was probably the first professional camera I ever used. It was right around that time, the XL1 and then the DVX100. The XL1 was like the independent documentarian, I don't know how you would, like what market it captured, like extreme sports, just anyone who wanted a camera that was like affordable, but like high quality. The XL1, great camera for the time. And that was Canon. And then Panasonic had the DVX100, which was, the XL1 didn't do 24 frames a second. And this is a long time ago now, going from memory, the DVX100 did do 24, like true 24. And people lost their minds because they're like, I can finally have cinema, 24 frames a second. It's beautiful. Funny enough, now you get people talking about like, well, I want to shoot 60 frames a second. And you're like, why would you want it to look that way? Oh, I like it. I like to shoot 120 and not slow it down and just like, for video games, I get it, but like it hurts my eyes watching anytime, like at the store, the TV is on like the fast refresh rate and like you're watching a movie and it just looks like trash. I'm sure I've talked about this before in other videos, but it's just something that like, it just blows my mind that like people want their footage to look that way when like not too long ago, people wanted 24, right? Cause it's like true 24 and like, this is the real deal. So it was the DVX100. And then shortly thereafter, Panasonic had the HVX 200. I don't know why they went with the 200. They didn't really, because it was DVX, it was HVX, different model, 200, and that was the only one they ever had. But that was like, actual digital HD. Well, not quite. The HVX 200 would squeeze all the footage. So it wasn't actually like 720p or like 1080. It was like 1080i and then like squished. So then like, you know, in like software, sometimes they'll be like, do you want square pixels? And you're like, yes, I want square pixels. Like pixels are square. No, no, no. These were like tall rectangle pixels that had to be like unsqueezed to be square pixels. So it was like this cheat to like get resolution into the camera and like, and it recorded on P2 cards. I still have my HVX recorded on P2s. I don't know if this is interesting for anyone, but like, yeah, reminiscing about old cameras. Anyway, oh yeah, I'll just keep going because fun stuff. I'm sure I'll tell these stories again sometime. HVX 200 recorded on P2 cards, and it was about a gig a minute, which is like normal for like HD, right? 1 GB per minute of footage. But the P2 cards that were like $1,000 for like the cheapest one was only 4 GB. So you could only record for 4 minutes before you had to switch cards. And unless you bought the really expensive P2 cards, which were like 8 GB or 16 GB. I think eventually they might have had a 32 or 64 GB P2 card. But that was just like, it was just like so unattainable. It was like 4 GB, 8 GB, 16 GB. So 16 minutes of squished HD footage was like so expensive. And so that's why I say, like, relatively speaking, now when you look at the Ursa Mini Pro 12K and you can get 12K for $10,000, like the HVX 200, I'm trying to remember what it was at the time. I don't know. I'm sure you could look it up, original like retail MSRP, but just the P2 cards alone, because it was proprietary media. And that's what always, it actually steered me away from Red and a few other companies that were doing that. Kind of, it seems like the industry's moved away from that a little bit, but the proprietary media, like you have to use our memory cards. P2 like ruined that for me. And I was like, no, never again. Like I want SD cards, like something I can buy at Best Buy or at Walmart, like an SD card that is universal, is cheap. I don't want anything custom, proprietary, where I have to pay Sony or Panasonic ridiculous rates, because that's the thing with P2 cards. They were custom for Panasonic, and so the prices never came down. No one ever made other ones because they only worked in a few different things. I forget what the actual port is. It's some kind of port, and there was a it was before the MacBook. So there was the PowerBook G4. One model of the PowerBook G4 had the port that matched with the P2 cards. And so like this was all like you had to have very specific to do things easily. Otherwise it was like external adapters and all that stuff. But to do things easily, to plug the card right into a laptop, you had to have a specific laptop that, you know, it's like it's just annoying. So anyway, I moved away from like ever considering cameras that needed like proprietary format type stuff, just because it's an inconvenience. Like that's how Red has been for the longest time. I think they may have opened it up more recently where you can use SSDs that are, you know, like they use that same thing that like a lot of these companies use. Like it's not safe to use, you know, it's got to be ours or it's not safe. What are these? What's wrong with these other companies? I get that they're rated for different performance and stuff, but like you're charging 10 times, maybe that's an extreme, but like 10 times as much as like what I can find on Amazon from like this other third party seller. What's so special about yours? Well, it's better. Like, okay, maybe twice is better, 3 times. Like, I don't like, how do you value how much better it is? Like, I get that you want to charge more for it, but like sometimes it's just price gouging. So informative. You're welcome. Thank you for tuning in. And like I said, this is the live part, but I record these this way anyway. So I figured I'd do it live and then have the clips separate for people who just don't, you know, they're not tuning into the live. They just want a short little quick thing about just the A7s Mark III. That's for them. The live stream is where we all can hang out. Steve says his first was the DVX 100A. Yeah. Funny enough, I've never actually shot film. I've never shot a film camera. I mean, I guess the Kodak disposable cameras, like those yellow disposable cameras, technically have film in it, and that's for photography. But I've never had to develop film. I've never shot film. Even went to film school. My film school didn't use film at that point in time. It was like a little bit too late where it was just like, all right, film was kind of becoming expensive. So I've never had that. in my skill set. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's probably a bad thing. It'd probably be good to know how to shoot film. Um, but also like it's just the norm, most people's nowadays, most like the new people, it's like what's their first video camera? It's probably their iPhone, or probably yeah, like a mirror, like a GH5 or something like that, A7s, something like that. 5D Mark II was a big milestone there, where like that was a lot of people's first cameras. So got into video before that. I'm trying to think of the gap difference between XL1, DVX, HVX, and then from there was HVX for quite a while, and then I finally went mirrorless hybrid photo style with the GH1. Actually, if you don't know about the GH1, the only reason that camera had any notoriety, and probably to this day why Panasonic has kind of lucked in a lot of ways to like being, from my perspective, dominant in the hybrid mirrorless game, is because the GH1 was hackable and the video was garbage. But because you could hack it and you could make it actually better, it turned out it was probably the best HD mirrorless camera at the time, because the 5D Mark II had so many issues and it wasn't really like, it wasn't meant to shoot video, but like they put it on there as like this cool thing because they figured out live view. And so they're like, well, yeah, if we can do live view, we can do video too, and we can record it, and here you go. And people were like, oh my God, you don't realize, Canon, you don't realize what you did. You unlocked Pandora's box, and now everybody wanted shallow depth of field, right, from a large sensor. And it's funny to see how Canon wasn't quite ready for it. I don't think they're at the beginning with the Mark II. It just hit them like wildfire. And what happened to be kind of like a cool little like tech thing of like, we could do live view so we can record it, changed the game forever. Because now you're talking about a camera that's only a couple $1,000s replacing cameras that were $10, $20, $30,000. And then that flood. And at that time, everyone knew the 5D Mark II, but the GH1 was just like, oh, it's just like another crappy consumer camera. The one I have is gold. I bought the gold one because I was like, yeah, I don't want a black camera. I want the gold one. I want to like, I don't want anyone to confuse this for the 5D Mark II, was my thought at the time. And I think they ended up locking it down to where I had to buy one. I had to buy a Chinese unit, I'm pretty sure, off of eBay, a Chinese model, because those ones, like the US ones, they stopped kind of allowing them to be hacked. Thank goodness that all ended up working out, because then the GH2 was incredibly successful, also hackable. And then the GH3 was kind of that in between that, like, I don't know, I'm sure some people bought a GH3, but it wasn't really essential or necessary at the time. And then the GH4, 4K, so cheap, so affordable, such a great camera. GH5, same thing, just but better. And that's why I'm excited for the GH6. But anyway, let's talk about Canon. Canon has finally their act together, and they've got a camera that it does everything that they promised that it was going to do. It does 8K, it does high frame rates, it does 4K 120, it has internal stabilization, it's got a flip screen, it's full frame, it's mirrorless. Canon has finally come back full force, and they're going to dominate once again, just like in the old days. Canon, the 5D Mark II, the Mark III. They went a little bit astray with the Mark IV. Not quite what we wanted, but they're back. They got rid of that mirror box. We're mirrorless. We're 8K. It's everything you could ever imagine. It's 422 10-bit. It does everything you would want. And the rumors were true. And it all came true. Except Canon had to do it again. Canon had to do it again. I talked about this. I did a live stream when there were rumors talking about the Canon R5 and how this is going to be 8K. And can you believe it? And oh my goodness. And I said, typically, cool if these rumors are true, but I bet there's going to be some sneaky little thing that's going to be wrong with it. There's something, I don't know what it is. Is it the codec? Is it a crop? Is it crop? Because that's what it was in the past, right? It was like, oh, it does 4K, but it's cropped. You're like, well, then why am I buying a full frame camera? No, it's not a crop this time. Is it the battery life? Is it the codec? Is it like the files huge? Well, the files are huge on the R5, but the Achilles heel of the R5 is that the thing overheats. People have talked about this. Canon has admitted it. They've said, yeah, it overheats. You can shoot for like 10 minutes, 20 minutes. Okay, great. So it doesn't actually shoot 8K. It shoots 8K for 10 minutes, and then it shoots absolutely nothing because I have to wait for it to cool down. And then I can shoot another 10 minutes of 8K, and then I can shoot absolutely nothing because the camera is overheated. I've seen, I think it's Tilta now. The influx of accessories is coming. External fans to keep your camera cool. Why even make it a feature if the camera can't actually do what you say it's going to do? Like, I can't imagine any other scenario where like the the product only works sometimes doing what they say that it does. The other time it doesn't work at all because it's overheated. Maybe I'm being too hard on Canon, but I do like the feeling of just saying I was right, and I'm actually sad to say I was right. I was so excited because here's the deal: Canon R5. The rumors were trickling out. It's going to shoot 8K. It's going to do all this great stuff. 4K 120. Whoa, it's going to shoot RAW. This is amazing. And it's only going to be like $4,000. And I was getting my pocketbook ready. I don't want to say pocketbook, my wallet, right? I'm getting my wallet ready. I'm like, oh, I can't wait. When this thing comes out, I might switch. So I shoot GH5, shoot Ursa Mini, but I'm like, wow, if I can do 8K, if I have all these amazing features, if I have that beautiful Canon footage, palm of my hand, full frame. Oh my goodness, here I come. I'm ready. Take my money, Canon. And then they announce a thing, and it's like, yes, rumors are true. It does everything you want, but it overheats. My wallet immediately went away, and I was like, no, thank you. And this is for the R5. Granted, I looked at the R6 as well, and I was like, okay, well, if I don't want your flagship, the R6 is a little cheaper. It's like $2,500. Do I want the R6? I don't necessarily need 8K, but I like a full frame camera. How about the R6? Well, it does 4K 60. Okay, well, that's what I kind of already have with the GH5, and with a speed booster, I'm like Super 35. I don't really see the need to upgrade to full frame, especially when I have all these lenses that work with what I have now. That's basically Super 35, which is, usually good enough. I get that some people want full frame, but like for me, it's not like you don't have to have it. Movies for the longest time have been shot Super 35, and like I don't think any audience member was complaining like, excuse me, this isn't full frame. Like, people watch the movie. They like how it looks, right? Because of other things, the lights, the sets, the actors. So anyway, but I wanted Canon to succeed. I wanted them to get back in the game, and they've thrown basically every feature you would want on a camera that then overheats, and you end up getting none of those features because you literally can't use the camera. So I don't know who this is meant for. I don't know who's excited to shoot for like 10 minutes and then like deal. Apparently the files are really annoying to edit as well. So it's like that Canon magic. It is always like every spell has like a consequence. I don't know what series is that where they have to. Oh, it's the Witcher, where like you have to like magic has a cost. That's the Canon magic. It has a cost, and what they can do with 8K comes with a sacrifice of like you can't use the camera. Fantastic. Anyway, the R6, because like the R5, I basically write it off. The files are going to be incredibly large and annoying to edit. Just eat up hard drive space, eat up cards. You're going to have to, oh my gosh, you're going to have so many cards, and they're so expensive, and you're just going to be bleeding money on hard drives and memory cards, storage space. And even then, you're only going to be using the camera for like a few minutes here and there, and then it's going to overheat, and like, what a nightmare. Theoretically, they could have a firmware update, but like they've come out and straight up just like admitted that like it overheats. So it seems to be like the intent. Like, I don't think there's anything to fix because they just now, if you look at the Panasonic S1h, also a full frame camera, also $4,000, doesn't do 8K, but it does 6K, shoots anamorphic as well. They put a fan inside that camera to cool it down. They even say on the product page for the Lumix S1h that it has a fan to prevent it from overheating. Panasonic told Canon how to do it. They said right on the spec sheet, like, yep, put a fan inside of it. And Canon was like, no, ours is going to overheat. It's really funny. It's really funny. Anyway, the R6, cool camera, I suppose, if you love Canon and you have RF lenses or you want to get into the RF system, because like it is probably the future for Canon, and their glass will all be in this kind of new RF mirrorless style. But for me, I just Canon has just like dropped the ball so many times over the past 10 years. They started the DSLR revolution with the 5D Mark II. By accident. They did it. They kicked it off, and they have not been able. It's incredible to watch a company fail so often, and like I guess they don't really get penalized for it, right? People still buy these cameras and they get excited, like the Canon R and the RP. Very popular on YouTube with the vloggers and people just, taking photos, and they want to do video as well. And like, but when you want a proper camera that like has the features that are like competitive in the marketplace, right? You don't have to go Panasonic, you don't have to go Sony, you don't have to go Blackmagic, but like they all kind of have that feature set that you're looking for. You say, okay, well, I want a camera that can do 4K 60, and like this camera can do it, this camera can do it, this camera can do it, this one can't. You're probably not going to get that one. And like, that's where Canon seems to be over and over and over again. And it's like, they thought, well, hey, we'll just leapfrog everybody and make 8K the new norm, except it's going to overheat. And then Sony just strolls along and says, hey, everyone, you've been waiting for that A7s Mark III. Here you go. Doesn't do 8K, but it does 4K, and it does it at 120 frames, same as the Canon. But guess what? Ours doesn't overheat. And everyone gives them a round of applause and says, thank you for not being ridiculous and giving us a camera that actually works. It's not really fair to sell a camera that doesn't work. And if it overheats, it's like you wouldn't buy a car that could only drive 10 miles and then it overheats. And then you have to wait another 10 minutes and you can drive 10 more miles. And you gotta wait 10 minutes. Like, you would not buy that vehicle. You wouldn't buy a Tesla if it only went 10 miles and then you had to recharge it, and then 10 miles and then you had to recharge it. You wouldn't do it. So I don't know why they think, I don't know who is going to be shooting 10-minute increments. And I keep using 10 minutes. I don't know the actual, like, well, you can shoot 20 minutes and then it's only 8 minutes. It's like, okay, so you can shoot roughly like 10 minutes of footage and then it overheats and you gotta, but buy the fan, buy ice packs, buy, I don't know. What do you have to buy? You have to buy extra stuff to make sure the camera doesn't overheat. And then the R6, if that one doesn't overheat and it does the bare minimum 4K 60, like Panasonic was doing years ago and the S1H does. Granted, the R6 is cheaper than the S1H. So if anything, this just makes me excited for what Sony has to come, which the A7s Iii is more expensive. It's about $3,500. So for $1,000 more, you get 4K 120 from the Sony versus Canon with the R6. You get 4K 60, which 4K 60, I mean, if you have a GH5, you've been shooting that way for a long, long time. I have, right? The Ursa Mini Pro Gen 1 did 4K 60. Gen 2 does 4K 120. So like these things are like quickly accelerating. And for Canon to say, hey, our flagship one is 8K, and then this other one is kind of like not quite cutting edge, but hey, it's full frame. Maybe there's something to be said about the autofocus. And if you have a bunch of Canon lenses, sure, fine. But it's just funny. It's not the brand or the cameras I would want to champion, because it's just comical. Like, this is the stuff we used to deal with 10 years ago when this stuff was just happening. And it was like, oh, okay, it's a photo camera and it can do video. And so like, I understand that there's recording time limits. I understand that it kind of overheats in certain situations. I understand that the codec isn't quite perfect for what I want, because I'm working around, because I'm taking the sacrifice that it's a photo camera that also does video. Now these cameras with Sony, the A7s Mark III, it is their video-centric camera. They say it in their marketing materials. They say, this is our video one. If you want the resolution one, go for the A7R. The A7S, low light video. That's what it's for. And Canon is doing the same thing, like, oh, 8K. Does that appeal to photographers? Maybe, but like, it sounds like a pretty video-centric thing to me. So if you say your flagship camera is a video camera, it should be able to shoot video and not be doing workarounds like we were 10 years ago, just accepting it and making do because it was the only camera that did it. There's plenty of cameras that do it, and you don't need 8K for every project, much less the file sizes and RAW and all the other stuff that's associated with it. Like that's really expensive to edit that footage. And you have this camera that can't even stay powered on because it's going to fry itself. It's going to melt. I live in Phoenix. Okay. Most people are dealing with 80-degree temperatures, 90, 100 if it's really hot in the summer. I deal with 120. It's going to overheat in like 2 seconds for me. So at the end of the day, it's just a deal breaker. And what's so funny is like I wanted to give Canon my money. I've not been nice to Canon, let's say, over the past, I don't know, whatever it's been since I've been making YouTube videos. It's like, yeah, I like the GH5. I like the GH4. I like Panasonic. I like Lumix. I like the Sony cameras. Canon is overpriced, and they don't have hardly the features you would want from a video perspective. I was willing to take all that back and say, I forgive you, Canon. I forgive you for what you've done. You've made mistakes, but you've finally seen the light. Thank you for leading once again. Thank you for leading once again. And they dropped the ball. I mean, I'm a pretty tough critic. I'm a pretty tough critic of Canon, and I was willing to give them my money for their R5 and go all in and go, I'm going to buy your lenses. I'm going to switch. I'm going to get rid of the Lumix. I'm going to go Canon. I'm going to go to the dark side. They're like, yeah, come over here. It's really hot. It's really hot over here. Oh, take a fan. You might need to cool down a little bit. And it's just comical. It's just funny. They are so close. Like, why even do it? Make a camera, put a fan in there. I don't understand what they're thinking, because I don't think you can update it with a firmware update. I don't think you can add a fan with firmware. Maybe there's some trickery they can do where you can go, you can do 15 minutes now. Oh. But like, people are supposed to use this on film sets. Hold on, actors. Hold on, director. Waiting for my camera to cool down. That's ridiculous. And the R6 is like a nice add-on, I suppose, if you want a full frame camera that's, $2,500, relatively cheap, but like, I guess, and you want to do 4K 60, like, it's a weird thing. Like, if I just wanted it for photos, you'd probably be fine with the R or the RP, some of the original Canon R cameras. So like, it's got 4K 60, but $2,500. I think I'd rather wait for other cameras. I'd rather go A7s Iii. I'd rather get a GH5. I'd wait for a GH6. Look at the S1h. I personally don't have it, but I would love to shoot with it eventually, because it looks like such a great camera. A little expensive, $4,000. A little expensive, because it doesn't really offer that much compared. Like, so I shoot also with the Ursa Mini Pro, and so like that's why it's like not really needed for some of the features it has. But like, I just love that. I love that mindset of like putting good features in the camera, and they work well. And it's a new system, and like the biggest uphill battle Panasonic has with the L mount is just getting the lenses out there, getting people to adopt it, all that stuff. Sony, they've been doing it right for a long time. And what's funny about Sony, they're not even necessarily doing that much that's like cutting edge. For the longest time, their batteries have been terrible. Their flip screen has been terrible. They've had recording time limits. They didn't do 4K 60 when they should have. Like, everything about the Sony A7s Mark II and the original Mark I is like, they're kind of like bare minimum. They're kind of like, well, yeah, like we do video, and like, so here you go. And people are like, yes, thank you. Like, thank you, full frame mirrorless camera, for like giving me video, because Canon hasn't been doing it. No one's been doing it. So Sony's like, it's not like they're blessing us and being nice and gracious and giving us good things. I look at that more as like Blackmagic. I feel like Blackmagic, they have the real Blackmagic that's like really good stuff, really affordable. But Sony's just like lucked into it because no one else was doing it. Nikon wasn't doing it. Canon wasn't doing it. Panasonic was like, no, we're micro four thirds. If you want a full frame camera, like, what do you? Of course, everyone went to Sony. and they gobbled up the market. It's not because they were doing anything especially good. It's just they were the only ones doing it. So now you got Panasonic with the S1H. There's the S1, and then is this the S1L? I don't know. There's another SKU or model of that. Canon finally went mirrorless. Nikon has gone mirrorless. Like everyone's going. It's the obvious future, and Sony beat them all to it, and that's why they're reaping the reward of just being there, making good glass, making good cameras, like good enough anyway. And now the A7s Iii, solid camera. If you're an A7s II shooter, definitely upgrade. But like Canon, it's just a joke. I don't know. I don't know who's excited about these things. I'm sure there's plenty of people out there on YouTube talking about how great the R5 is and oh, it's beautiful and it's cinematic and blah, blah, blah. Most of the stuff they're shooting is because it has good production value. It has good lighting. It has good sets. It has good actors. It has good hair and makeup. You don't need 8K for any of those things. It's a higher resolution. It's going to look sharper. It's going to look crisper. But like the money is elsewhere. The money is in the flamethrowers and the rocket launchers and the smoke effects that you're doing on set to make it look that way. Someone's cat video isn't going to look like that, even though it's an 8K. It's just going to melt the camera. So you can film your cat, or you can film your backyard. You can film some bushes. I wanted to like it. I wanted to buy it. I was like, man, that live stream, I was really wrong. I was too harsh on Canon back then. The original one, I mean, that I criticized them. But no. Just on schedule, right on time. There's Canon with that Achilles heel that just says, hey, it's a great camera. Except not this, it's not cropped this time, right? But that was last time, the 5D Mark IV. Hey, the 5D Mark IV does what you want. No, it doesn't. It has a crop. That's not what we want. They go, oh, how about the R5? Does what you want. No, I don't want a camera that overheats. Stop putting out garbage. Now, it's maybe, okay, that's a little too far. It's not garbage. 8K is cool on a package, on a spec sheet. But in actual use, I don't want to have to deal with a camera giving me a headache, making everyone around me frustrated at the fact that I can't actually use my camera because I wanted to be the guy who was like, oh, guys, we can shoot 8K now. Isn't this amazing? And they go, actually, we can't because your camera keeps overheating. So we're shooting 0K because it's overheating. The R6, I suppose, get it if you want, but like Canon still, I don't know when they're officially dead to me. I mean, they kind of have been for a while. I thought this was maybe like that last little, like they were going to finally win me over with something, but no. Look elsewhere. Find something else that doesn't overheat, that continuously records, that does everything you want it to do. And yeah, stop giving Canon your money. They don't deserve it. Checking out the comments here, the chat. The Tilt-A-Fan is real. I thought it was. I saw it on Instagram. If it's a joke, that's a really funny joke because I thought it was real. That's how bad the overheat. They're like, I'm sure if Tilt is not doing it, somebody's doing it. They're gonna make a fan. And if they were smart, Canon would have just put it inside, like Panasonic did with the S1H, and they were like, yeah, it gets hot, so we put a fan in there. GH6. We'll see what happens. Eventually, like I take photos too, and the GH5 does a good job with photos. If it's something professional or higher end, I'm going to go with the 5D. So that's like, so for photos, like maybe that's something for context. I do have Canon stuff for photography specifically. Not necessarily by choice, but just because that's what's happened over the years. It's not like I love it, but like it does a full frame camera for photography specifically. I'll use that. So I've thought about getting the S1H for photography, as well as video, but it's like I don't actually need it. So $4,000 is kind of expensive when you're like don't need the product. You're like, well, why am I buying this? Like I have a full frame camera that can take photos. I have GH5, can shoot with the Ursa Mini. It's like, why do I need this other? Why am I spending money just to spend money? So that's the thing. It's like you want these things because they're cool, and it's it does have it all in one. Wouldn't that be so easy? And it's like, yeah, it would be, but is it worth it? Like, no, probably not, because then there's going to be like an S2H and an S3H and an S4H. Like, there's going to be more versions of this. So only buy something when you actually need what it's offering you, and it's not just like nice to have. Like, buy stuff when you need it, because otherwise you're almost always going to have regret. I have seen Sony come from being an underdog to being the one to beat. The R5 has served as a benchmark for the S3. Yeah. I mean, Sony was just smart. Like they read the market. They've been future focused. And again, I think it's just because they didn't actually have competition. They've been competing with nobody. They've been competing with themselves. People are like, when's the S3 coming? It's like, why do they don't even need to put it out there. Like no one, well, I guess, I mean, 4K 60 on a full frame camera, that's like a relatively newer thing. But now they're doing 4K 120 with the S3. So it's like Sony is like staying ahead by kind of doing the bare minimum. They finally fixed their stupid flip screen. So there's some stuff like that that's like they didn't have to fix their flip screen because like who are they competing with? Even if you recommended like, oh, like that's, I don't know, I think that's like kind of, that's probably in the hybrid video space. I mean, the most popular cameras I would wager are like the GH5 and like the A7s Mark II right now, given what's actually available that you could go buy right now. This other stuff is coming. The GH5, it's like, wow, it does all this stuff. It's got flip screen, it's good battery life, it's got everything you would want. And what do the Sony people say? It's not full frame though. You go, yeah, but like it can shoot 4K 60. It's not full frame though. Yeah, but this flip screen, it's so convenient. Isn't that so nice? Isn't it not full frame though? Well, you can get like a Metabone speed booster and it's like Super 35. Yeah, but it's not full frame though. It's like, okay, but you can shoot 4K 30. It's like, yeah, but it's full frame. So it's like, that's the thing. It's like Panasonic just, for whatever reason, Micro Four Thirds, I don't know what the trick was. I don't know why people believed, because I mean, you still have these people like, right? Oh, it's a smaller sensor. So theoretically, the lenses are smaller and they're also cheaper. Both of those things are true, but they're not significantly smaller from my perspective, my opinion. And they're not significantly cheaper either because lenses last a really, really long time. So if you're saying, oh, well, it's $1,000 more, it's like, yeah, but spread over the course of like 10 years, you're talking about like $100 a year. Like that's not that big of a difference. So granted, up front it can be more expensive, but like the Micro Four Thirds, oh, it's a smaller sensor, so the lenses are smaller, so you can put it in your pocket. It's like, well, first of all, none of these cameras will fit in your pocket with a lens attached, right? Like, just that's like it's not an option. They're not pocketable. So now you're talking about if they're lightweight or not. In which case, does it matter? I think it depends, but none of these cameras are heavy. It's just varying degrees of lightness. If that makes sense. Yes, it's the Canon Cripple Hammer. Reading through the chat. The only 4K who doesn't overheat is awful. Oh, I assume this is on the Canon R5 or R6. At least as shown by Tony Northrup did a video. As an owner of an Canon R, I'm reconsidering my life choices. It's cool that Canon is finally doing mirrorless. Like, that is cool, I guess. Sony has some competition, but like the way it's playing out, like I think Canon will win because it has the name recognition. It has the lens, like the lenses are all familiar, right? They have a 70-200, the RF version that looks sort of like the original 70-200. So it's just like Canon is iconic, and it has that like mythos for like older shooters, people who've been doing this for a while, who like remember the glory days of like the 5D Mark II. Canon has been running on those fumes. Eventually they're running out of that because newer shooters are shooting Sony. And so they're going to grow up and they're going to get older, and they don't have any allegiance to Canon. They don't care. They like the Sony because that's what they shot with. That was their first camera. And so you'll see that where it's like a company can last for like a generation off of like nostalgia and good vibes, like running on the fumes. But like they immediately fall off a cliff once those people just like phase out and they're done. And this new generation has like it's been gobbled up by Sony and Panasonic for that matter. Like look at that with Nikon. Like does anybody in the video space even talk about Nikon? No, why would you? They don't offer anything to like they only cater to photographers. And so if you're a photographer who also wants to do video, you're going to be looking at Canon, you're going to be looking at Sony. If you're a video person who also wants to do photos, you're going to be looking at Panasonic and you're going to be looking at Sony and theoretically maybe Canon, but you're not going to be looking at Nikon in any of this. And that's the Sony did it. Canon has been getting participation trophies for too long. Absolutely. Let's see. I'm just going through here. I got to find my spot. The first 8 minutes look real. Yeah, the first 8 minutes look really good. And then from there, it's like switch to the other mode where it looks like trash. The story makes the movie, not the camera, 100%. For now, the R6 looks better for video, even without the 8K, but it still overheats. And then the codec. So apparently the R6 overheats too. And you need ice packs for that one as well. And it's got a terrible codec. Surprise, surprise. I don't know what to tell you. If you still love Canon, because that's what, like, I don't know, for whatever reason, everyone wants to like love on Canon. It's not a good choice. I used to dread the days of 20-minute Sony battery days and then the overheating. So embarrassed in real life project, at least in a minute you were back. Can't imagine waiting 10 minutes. Yeah, so that's the thing with Sony, why like I didn't go the A7s route or the A7s II, because having used those cameras, the batteries, I think I said in a video, they're like the fun size Snickers. They're this tiny little candy bar size thing. No one wants that, like in candy or in batteries. So having something like GH4, GH5 that can run for like an hour plus, that don't overheat, that are like just bulletproof and just work. It's like you don't want the tool to get in your way. Like in any industry, not even just in photography or video, but like anything. Like you don't want product like tools that overheat or you can't use them or they don't work right or they run out of battery really fast. Like at that point, it's more of an irritant than anything else. It says Canon has been getting participation trophies for too long. Canon, I can sell the best wireless strobe systems. Fair enough if you're doing strobe lighting and exclusively photography, but like can't use strobes for video. So I mean you can, but it looks like a strobe light. So the Panasonic S1h, yeah, the Panasonic S1h, I have yet to actually personally use it, but this camera is like it's everything. The people. Okay, so I'll say this again. The S1h. I did not buy and I have not bought because I don't actually need it. I just want it because it looks like a great camera. But everything that it does, I can do with either the GH5, a 5D for Canon 5D for photography, or with the Ursa Mini Pro. So I don't actually have a reason to get an S1H other than like I just want one. And at that point, $4,000 is too much. If it was like $2,000, $2,500, maybe. No, if it was $3,000, I still probably wouldn't get it. But like $2,500, right? Let's say, or $2,000. Like if it was in that range, I would get it. But for $4,000, it's like, I probably should go to something else because I don't actually need it. But if I were a Sony shooter, if I were a Canon shooter, if I Nikon or like if I were shooting anything other than what I currently have, which is the GH5, the Ursa Mini Pro, and a 5D Mark IV for photography, I would hands down get an S1H. Full frame, 6K, stabilization, flip screen, batteries, memory card. I think it comes with Vlog. Like it does everything you want, you know. I think there's like one little goofy thing. Like if I recall, there's something I heard, and again, I haven't tested it myself, but I won't even. If someone can confirm if you can shoot with shutter angle on the S1H, I would love to know, because apparently I saw somewhere that like it doesn't have shutter angle, in which case I'm like, what's wrong with you, Panasonic? Like, come on. You have to have shutter angle. Like if you don't know shutter angle, I've done way too many videos on it. They still do well on YouTube because apparently people are constantly learning about shutter angle. Shutter angle is the way to shoot video. Do not use shutter speed. Most of these cameras don't even advertise it as a feature because like no one even knows about it or no one cares, relatively so. I mean, a lot of people do know about it, but like you'll never see it on the specs page of like, you can shoot with shutter angle, but it's like one of the most important film cinema camera tools to have, to be able to set 180-degree shutter and just leave it there, or change it if you need to, depending on the circumstance. But for the most part, you want to leave it there. I've done way too many videos on the subject, and people are constantly like, oh, cool, awesome, awesome, cool. So if you can't do shutter angle on the S1H, I would be very surprised and very disappointed. But that should be an easy firmware upgrade, right? That should be easily added to any camera, and it should be on every camera. Now that we're doing hybrid video, like it used to be that people would say, oh, it's a photo camera. Why would you use a photo camera for video? Why would you use a photo camera for video? It's meant for taking pictures. Why would you use a photo camera for video? It's like, well, because video is motion pictures. So photography, motion pictures is video. They kind of are one and the same. One is moving, one is static, but they essentially are doing the same thing. So I think it's totally valid to use a photo camera for video. Now that we're kind of past that point and everyone has kind of admitted and said like, oh, we should have cameras that do both. At least, not everybody, but like a good portion of people are kind of like, yeah, we should have cameras that do both, like hybrids. Yeah, that makes sense. Now that we're at that point and video is at the forefront of all of these new cameras, Canon, they're saying 8K. Sony, they're saying 4K, 120 frames per second, right? That is not a photo feature. That is a video feature. Like all the stuff they're putting out there at the forefront is like video centric because they know it matters. Now that we're at that point, like shutter angle is critical. It should be on all these cameras if it's not. Just reading through the chat. Cameras are a YouTuber point of view. I think you hear the perspective on these cameras and active professional in the industry, not just a YouTuber point of view. Keep it up. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I definitely have thoughts to share. I'm sure a lot of people may or may not agree. And I am biased. Like I'm biased because I shoot with what I shoot because I have a reason to, right? It's like I have an opinion because the tools do what I want them to do. I like the Blackmagic Ursa Mini Pro for reasons. I like the GH5 for reasons. So yeah, I'm biased, I suppose, in that regard, but like, I think it's also a good thing to like understand why someone does something. Like I wouldn't say everybody has to have a GH5 or everybody has to shoot the Ursa Mini Pro. No, I think there's definitely people who like, it makes sense to get an A7S, an A7R. These cameras make sense for people in different situations and different circumstances. In fact, I work with somebody who has Sony cameras, Sony glass. He loves the Sony cameras. Totally valid. It's not like one size fits all. It's understanding, okay, this person uses this camera or these tools for these scenarios. I either, watching them, I either relate to that and that's something similar to how I do my work, or that's very different. So I would look at different circumstances, and understanding why people do stuff is far more important than like knowing like what they use. Just someone saying like, oh, I shoot with the Canon R5. It's like, okay, great. Why do you do that? Like, I would be curious to know why and why they would justify, it's like, oh, well, Canon paid me. It's like, well, okay, duh, then that's why you shoot it. Yeah, they're paying you. It's you're sponsored. You're a Canon ad. You're part of Canon's marketing team. Of course you shoot with their camera. Why would you go out of your way to buy this, and why then would you want to shoot with it? I'm sure people will buy the R5. Like, they will. It's Canon. But why? Because it shoots 8K? It's like, okay, well, it's not a good enough reason, especially if you're dealing with it overheating. But before anyone buy a new camera today, go and buy a freaking good PC first. Yeah, lots of other good things to buy before a new camera. Lights, audio equipment, but lights are probably one of the biggest ones. Good lenses are always valuable. I really like the Sigma 18 to 35. That's a lens I use probably the majority of the time. Really cheap lens, but really great lens. Granted, it's not full frame. I recently used the Laowa probe lens. A lot of fun, really cool. Definitely specific certain look, but it's a look that you can't really get any other way. Those kind of macro, but like super wide macros is kind of a neat effect for certain things. So yeah, like invest in that kind of stuff. And that probe lens is actually a full frame lens, so could last you basically to any camera you're working with, unless you're going medium format, which is now, what is it? The G50? Is it who makes that? Is it Fujifilm? Medium format video. It's the future. We'll see. We'll see. I still have f-mount lenses. Yeah, for Nikon. I still have Nikon f-mount lenses because they're basically the like most universal lens to adapt, or one of, at least. I don't know of another lens system that's like more adaptable, but you can basically put a Nikon f lens on basically any camera. So like the older ones that have manual aperture rings and stuff are really cool and really valuable. They're not the best optically, but some people like that. They don't want it like super perfect. They want it kind of artsy. Nikon Z6 is amazing. Honestly, the Z6 I haven't looked at enough. Maybe I should give Nikon a little bit of my attention, but I just don't feel like they deserve it because they've been sleeping for so long. But I'll check out the Z6 if you say it's good. I shoot ProRes RAW with the Z6. It works. The codec isn't as good as B-RAW, in my opinion. All right, fair enough, fair enough. I hardly ever shoot RAW, and it's because the files are just too gosh darn big. A lot of the stuff that I film is longer takes, typically lit, so you lit like with lights. So not always in a desperate need for dynamic range. It does come up from time to time. But yeah, the file sizes are like to shoot like a raw interview, let's say like an hour-long interview with somebody, and have that all raw is like pretty taxing on your hardware, on your from cost, and also editing and workflow. So a lot of the times it doesn't seem worth it, especially when you're considering end delivery platform of where the video is ultimately going. It just really depends on the project, really. But yeah, for a lot of the time, I'm not shooting raw hardly at all. It's valuable in certain circumstances, but you really have to have the workflow and the project optimized for it. Like, there's a lot of stuff that you'll see online. People will do like ungraded, and then they'll be like, I shot this raw, and then here's how I color corrected it. And it's like, you could have done the exact same color correction to ProRes, and and not ProRes RAW, right? But like just like traditional ProRes. You could have done the same color correction. It would have looked exactly the same. But because the change is so drastic from like a flat log profile to like beautiful golden fields or whatever the image is, it's like, oh, wow, you need RAW to do that, to make that radical transformation. Or, oh my gosh, look how beautiful that is. It's because it's RAW. It's like, no, the shot is just beautiful. And you could have done that with ProRes. Them saying like the fact that it was shot RAW wasn't actually part of that equation, even though it's kind of implied that it is. So just something to look out for. Like, you have to do your own tests and see like, okay, I'm going to shoot this raw. I'm going to shoot the exact same thing like ProRes or even H.264, color grade them and see like what the actual difference is and how often you're in that situation where you would want to then replicate that. Oh, I always shoot people against windows. And so stuff like I need the extra dynamic range. It's like, okay, well, I guess maybe, but a lot of the time you may not actually need it. Oh, you know, it's kind of cool. I think I can do this. This person says I get an hour and 3/4 on my S1H during video. Good to know. I would be curious. Can you use shutter angle? I'm envious of the S1H's anamorphic options. The GH5 does anamorphic. And you know what? Anamorphic isn't always necessarily for anamorphic. So this is good to know. Anamorphic, what is it? The Siru 1.33x. I think it's a micro four thirds lens, anamorphic, but 1.33 stretch is meant for 16:9 to stretch to cinemascope, right? To anamorphic, but 1.33. But 1.33 isn't actually that much of a stretch. So I have an LA 7200. It's an old school anamorphic adapter for the DVX 100. It's a 1.33, and it was meant to take 4:3 to 16:9 at the time. And then if you use it 16:9, it gets you to that cinema kind of look. But it's not that aggressive of a stretch. So the anamorphic characteristics that you are going after aren't as strong and pronounced as like a 2x anamorphic. In which case, for 2x to get to that like proper that stretch, you want to start with a 4:3 aspect ratio. So that's what like the anamorphic mode is on most of these cameras, right? Shoots 4:3, and then you have the option to display it unsqueezed if you're using a 2x. And I have a oh shoot, what's it called? It's the I think it's the SLR Magic one. No, what's it called? I forget the name. But it's a 2x anamorphot. That's what it is. It's the SLR Magic Anamorphot 2x. And when you're shooting anamorphic, there's some tricky, goofy stuff. It is more cumbersome. It is more irritating to shoot anamorphic because it slows you down. And it's not always optically pristine as you would want or you might be used to with some like just spherical photography lenses. But anyway, this is all to say, maybe this is all stuff, you know, that's like standard about anamorphic, but to set that baseline, the fact that these cameras give you a 4:3 mode can actually be really advantageous, especially in a world now where people are publishing video content, you know, 1:1 or even 9:16. And if you're in a situation where you need to kind of shoot multi-aspect, if you're starting 16:9, well, now to go to 9:16, that's a radical change. Even to go from 16:9 to 1:1 is a pretty big change. But if you start with 4:3 and you can strategically film in such a way that you can crop 16:9, but you can also crop 1:1 and 9:16, you get a little bit more of a universal aspect ratio. Slightly. I mean, ideal would probably be 1:1, but most cameras don't shoot by 1:1. So with an anamorphic mode, you don't always have to use it with an anamorphic lens. You could shoot just 4:3, which would be kind of crazy, right? Like who want like 4:3, that's standard F. Well, no, you're getting all the resolution. You're getting the 4K or the 6K resolution in a 4:3 container. You can use a spherical lens, not shoot it anamorphic, but just put it in anamorphic mode. Don't de-squeeze it or any of that stuff. And you get kind of like this kind of cool quasi in between everything for projects where you're delivering for the client, maybe a 16:9, a 1:1, and a 9:16. So just a little tip there. Because now in today's age of social media and video content being everywhere all the time, a lot of times projects get reversioned, what seemingly seems like an endless number of platforms. So I wouldn't always recommend it of like, oh yeah, I always shoot 4:3, but like you can, and it can be helpful in certain situations. Yes, you can select shutter angle on the S1H. Good to know. Thank you. Here, confirmation. You can shoot shutter angle on the S1H. I appreciate it because that's something I heard and I was like, that's really goofy. But if anything, I just want to rent the camera to actually test it before I go and buy it. But I'm also secretly hoping for a price drop. I don't know if that's bad. Probably is. I mean, you know, it's not like it's good to, if companies make a good product, yeah, we'll vote with your wallet. But it's just a little expensive. Kind of like you like secretly, you wait long enough and you're like, oh, that price is going to come down. Then I'll get it. But then at that point, there'll probably be the S2, S2H, in which case I might get that. Do the S1H being 6K, you can also live crop at 1080. This makes primes look like zooms. Chat is jumping around. Sorry, 1 second. Tony says, I love the S1H. I love my Mirror C500 Mark II. I'll shoot on any camera tool. That's a great point. Shoot with whatever works for you. Get comfortable with a lot of different cameras. That's one thing that is really, really valuable. Understand the ins and outs of multiple systems. So you're not like, some people you'll hand them, if they're familiar with Sony and you hand them a Lumix, they'll go like, I don't know what I'm doing. Or it's like, hey, here's the Ursa, like shoot. And they're like, I don't know how to use this. It's like, the more you get familiar with different cameras, the easier it is to pick up new ones and just kind of swap between them, because you start getting used to like, okay, this is kind of how Canon menus work. This is how Sony menus work. So even if it's a slightly different camera, you can then like adjust on the fly to new updates. If it's a Mark II version and you only use the Mark I, it's like you can kind of figure it out. It's the imperfections in the Sony. It makes me love them. They don't have everything, but what they have is 100% of their effort. Working with limits makes me a better shooter. Fair enough. If that's what makes you attracted to Sony. I just have always, I'm video first, photography second, and that's why the GH cameras have always captured my attention and my dollars. Yeah, 1.33 isn't anamorphic enough. True. So yeah, that's the new stuff that's coming. There's always going to be more new stuff coming, I'm sure. Not every week, every month, maybe. I don't know. We'll see what happens. But I am eagerly anticipating a follow-up to the S1H and a follow-up to the GH5. I'm curious to see what route Panasonic takes, because it's the longer time goes on, the more obvious it is that micro four thirds is not necessarily what everyone wants, and it works. And you get to Super 35 with a speed booster. I don't know the logistics of it. I made a video a long time ago saying that the GH cameras should go APS-C or like Super 35. And people said, oh, the lenses wouldn't work. And what about this? And what about that? But like, if you look, there's the JVC LS300. I did a review on this years ago. It's a micro four thirds mount with a Super 35 sensor. And what that means is that you can use a speed booster on it and you can get full frame lenses on that camera and you can get a full frame, you can get full frame glass, full frame look, basically close. I know it's not like perfect, it's not exact, but like a lot of these cameras, it's not exact, right? Because they all use slightly different sensor sizes anyway. But you can basically get full frame on a micro four third mount, not a micro four third sensor. It's a Super 35 sensor with a micro four third mount. I don't know of another camera that's done that, and I don't know why JVC did it, other than it's just awesome and it's a cool thing to do. Because if the lenses aren't compatible with the size of the sensor, just crop. That's what all of these full frame cameras do when you put APS-C lenses on them, right? It's like, it's a full frame sensor. You put an APS-C lens on and the camera knows, oh, crop. So you don't have, the porthole effect. You could do the exact same thing with like a GH6, theoretically, put a Super 35 sensor in there, and any micro four thirds lens that doesn't cover the full frame, you just crop it, like totally fine. But if you're in a situation where you have something that does cover Super 35, or you're shooting with a speed booster or adapting full frame lenses, or however you're shooting, because hopefully these companies know, hopefully Panasonic knows that people are putting other lenses, not every lens that people are putting on their cameras native. They should know that people are using full frame lenses on their micro four thirds camera. It'd be really cool to see them make a GH6 with a Super 35 sensor. I think that'd be cool. I don't think they'll do it, but I think it'd be really cool. GH5S kind of has an oversized sensor. I actually don't know what the sensor is in the GH5S. I only have the GH5. The S didn't seem worth the upgrade. Seemed kind of like an offshoot, like when you have, what was it, like video game consoles to it, right? Where they're like the PlayStation 4 and then the PlayStation 4 Pro. Like, okay, thanks. Can I play the same games? Cool. Like so it's not the PlayStation 5 then. All right, great, good to know. That's kind of what the GH5S seemed like. And also, recalling, I don't know where the prices are now, but at the time it seemed like oddly much more expensive for the S. And you lost, what did you lose? Internal stabilization? I think that's what you lost on the GH5S. It's like, oh, wait, okay, so no, I want the GH5. I don't want to pay more money for less features. I know it's better in low light, but again, we've talked about this before. I typically use lights, so I'm not at like a deficit of lights where I need to shoot in darkness. Typically, I need ND filters built into the camera because it's so stinking bright. That's typically what I need. So, man, if they do, I mean, that's truly the future for Panasonic for the Lumix cameras. If they truly embrace their video side, start doing cool stuff with like electronic ND, variable ND type stuff, like at the sensor level. So you basically have built-in NDs, not like an Ursa Mini where it's like a filter wheel, but an electronic variable ND internally. So like you have that right in there. It is one of the most helpful features that is so often overlooked of like, oh, we'll just get a variable ND or get NDs you put on the lens. It's like, yeah, but when I'm switching lenses, I have to then switch the filter and it's not always the right size. Or what if I'm using cinema lenses and like I have to have a matte box. Like having external filters that, because almost like no lens is the same, right? They all have different sizes and different filter types. And there's a new product, I forget what it's called, but a few people are talking about it online, where it basically adapts, but you're still screwing and unscrewing, and like you have this extra device that's really annoying and irritating. Having the built-in NDs, like, I don't know, like it was normal. It was normal on broadcast cameras for the longest time to have built-in NDs. And people will say, well, that's not a cinema feature. Like a cinema camera has a matte box. It's like, why would I want more stuff on my camera if I didn't need it? Like if it's built right in, isn't that better? Well, that's not true cinema. Like, well, I just want it convenient is really what I want. I want it to look good and be easy. And I don't want to be like running around outside and being like, oh shoot, I forgot my filter. It's in the other bag. Now I have to shoot with the high shutter speed, or now I can't use the aperture I want, or now like, because it's too bright, like built-in NDs. People, when they talk about photography and video and exposure, they usually talk about aperture, ISO, and shutter. And for video, you can't, and for photography in certain situations, you have to factor in NDs. If you want to do, for photography, if you want to do long exposures during the daytime, you have to have NDs. Like you have to. So, and then for video, it's like your shutter. For video, your shutter, I think, for the most part, is always 180 degrees, right? For almost every situation, 180-degree shutter angle, no matter what you're doing. No matter what frame rate you're shooting, 180-degree shutter angle, stick to that. Your footage will look good. So, and you don't really have control over your shutter. You want an aperture that's, shallow depth of field, probably, because you want the background to be kind of blurred. And you want the ISO to be as low as possible, or like native, so that it's not grainy, right? So it's clean. So for the most part, when you're shooting video, your shutter is kind of chosen for you. Your aperture is probably going to be, f4, maybe 2.8, maybe 5.6, like when I'm shooting the Ursa Mini Pro. That's typically what it is. It's like 2.8 if I need the extra light, 5.6 if I need the extra depth of field. But like f4 in general is like a pretty safe bet for Super 35 to have like shallow depth of field, but still have stuff in focus. So like an eyelash isn't like, like it's just an eyelash and everything else is blurry. It's like f4. It's like, okay, so I'm typically 180-degree shutter, typically f4, On the Ursa, native ISO is 800, so I'm always there. I'm not even controlling exposure with anything other than NDs, almost hardly, like most of the time. And thankfully on the Ursa Mini, they're built in, Ursa Mini Pro anyway, they're built in. So like when people overlook NDs or they like neglect them or, oh, you don't need that, or, oh, it's not that big of a deal. It's like, that's how I'm controlling exposure almost all the time. If it's a GH5, I'm using ISO a little bit more liberally, but on the Ursa Mini, it's like, it's kind of set. Like, and I'd recommend that for anybody. It's like 180-degree shutter, f4. If it's the Ursa Mini, ISO 800. The only fluctuation you have there is NDs, and the NDs are in 2-stop increments. So then sometimes it's like a little bit too aggressive, in which case you just have to adjust your aperture is really how I look at it. But I do the NDs first, and it's like, oh, it's a little too dark, change my aperture. Oh, it's a little too bright, change my aperture. But you're in that f4 region, and that works almost all the time. It's kind of, I don't know, it's like a little too easy, but it's true. It's a little too easy. I'll wrap this up because I've been talking for far too long. Just a few final comments in the chat. I always have a soft spot for the GH series. Great little tools. Maybe that's a good spot to end. The GH cameras, great cameras. And Canon has a pretty good system with the EF to RF adapter. NDs are built into it with a wheel. Yeah, so there are adapters, right, that you can have NDs built in, but like, I think for this is why I want it built in on the GH6. If you have an electronic ND, a variable ND built into the camera, you put a Super 35 sensor in, you keep the micro four thirds mount. So you're not changing GH, it's still micro four thirds, but the sensor's big. Now you can use a speed booster to get basically almost full frame on a GH6, and that adapter, which would normally have NDs in it, has the speed, is a glass in there, right? So it's a focal reducer. Am I getting that right? There's a focal reducer and a focal, it's a speed booster. You know what it does. Focal reducer. There's glass in there. So you don't have room in the speed booster for an ND. And I wouldn't really want to put it in there anyway. In the camera's better. That way it doesn't matter what lens you have, what adapter you're using. It doesn't matter. It's in the camera to adjust exposure, just like your aperture settings are. I mean, granted, they're on the lens, but they're in the camera, right? You set them in the camera, you set ISO in the camera, you set shutter in the camera, you should set ND in the camera as well. And that would be the dream. Give it 4K 120 to compete. Give it 6K. I don't care, whatever. Give it 8K. Give it 12K, apparently. And yeah, just make more of the video features, the video side of things more accessible, right? They did that with the HDMI port being a full-size HDMI. You could give it SDI, I suppose. It's probably unnecessary. But hey, if you did it, why not? If I'm Panasonic, sure. And I don't know. I'd be curious to see if they could figure out a way to get proper like XLR without some stupid box adapter. That's the other really annoying thing about the GH or any mirrorless camera, hybrid camera for that matter, is like your audio inputs just aren't as robust as they are in like premium cameras like the Ursa Mini. Like you have XLRs that just plug right in, and not like some stupid octopus adapter dongle thing. Like no, like XLR port, like they're big, so like they probably are. I don't know, maybe you could go into the bottom of the camera if that. No, that'd be stupid. You can put it on a tripod. I don't know how they do it, but it would be on my wish list. Thank you, everyone. Plan is to publish these videos as separate ones so they're more digestible. But thank you, everyone, for hanging for the live stream. It's been fun. I need to turn the fan on, though. It's getting warm in this room.